One.
All right.
Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is episode number 48, I believe. I just want to check to be sure. Yes, and we're recording it on Thursday, Christmas Eve at 6:57 Eastern Time. And so we're just talking about bringing a woman onto the show to help us understand God better and explain God better to the world. Because again, like Joshua and I are guys and we have a guy perspective. I think, it's not like, it's not like women don't understand the guy perspective and guys don't understand the woman perspective, but I think it's good to have, even though we understand each other's perspective to a certain extent, it's very different from being, for example, a guy, being a woman and all. So what I think it's going to be good. And the other part is like, Josh, let us know what, all right. So in terms of like, you say she does great work with getting infants who have not been aborted, adopted, which is wonderful. But have you spoken with her about her her thoughts about God, how she conceives God, why these abortions are happening to begin with? I mean, we want to kind of like explore these questions.
Sure, George. Yeah, now let's talk about abortion. I don't have a problem with abortion. I think abortion is great because we can't think clearly on the subject. At what point does abortion not become great? Let's say, all right, there's a lot of people in the world that would have been better off if they were aborted. It could have saved a lot of pain, misery, and suffering, would have prevented a lot of global catastrophe.
Yeah, but you can't tell when they're born. You can't tell how they're going to develop,
Well, no, but that's nonsense logic, George. If there's any value in having a parent, having a good parent, if your family's in crisis, if your parents are poor and they're severely mentally disturbed or addicted, and they say, okay, I'm not fit to be a parent, right? The only choice is adoption. But for us to start this nonsensical religion where we praise, or we demonize abortion is just no different than the slut shaming that religions have been doing forever. Now, there is some.
Gosh, wait a minute. I mean, like, you don't believe that ending as many lives as die of every other cause of death combined.
At what point is it okay? There's some technical details, right? So let's just make it easy for your side of the argument. What if there was no technology to perform abortion? All we could do is kill them as soon as they were born, right? Then it becomes a little easier argument. And we could say, okay, we're killing a baby, even if it's just 1 second old, we're killing a baby. And that becomes a little easier to have a stance on. Now let's take it the other way, all right? To the far extreme where, for instance, contraception is demonized in many religions, right? And this is actually what the Catholic Church has caused a ton of suffering and poverty and famine and disease in the third world because of this view, They would rather a human being suffer their whole entire life than somebody have access to a condom, right? It's just such shadow projection, right? Now let's step it up just a little bit more. What if there was this abortion technology or it was really good, and this, as soon as the sperm entered the egg, or soon as there was signs, right? It's obviously has no consciousness like we think of, then the abortion could be performed, right? So the problem with all these things is they're politicized, and it's really just it's politicians and religious people projecting their own shadow when they haven't been taught how to think logically and rationally, because none of them are, and I'm not that good at it either because I grew up in these same nonsense schools, right? So largely the abortion, if you look at, we wouldn't even know of the issue if it wasn't for the Catholic Church making it such a big issue, because they're projecting the shame that they put on their own daughters and women that they experienced, and then they pass on to their daughters of sexuality, right? So
all right, let's shift, because like the abortion is, we're on clearly on different sides on this, but I want to more, let's describe this woman's religious God beliefs according to like, how you understand them so far.
Let's shift to let's do that, but let's do it this way. Let's because I don't want to talk about somebody when they're not present, right? So, or their beliefs. So let's talk about last episode. A woman came to mind that could be on the show that you thought of, and she was an atheist. Was one of your reservations, right? Or one of the, you know, thoughts that came to mind. So let's just talk in general about how do we do this? How do we uh, what are the considerations, and maybe how do we prepare ourselves personally for inviting, personally, and the relationship that you and I have, um, to inviting more people in, and particularly of the female gender. um, that's what I would be more comfortable with. I haven't
All right,
really
I've
thought
got
of
an
how to do
idea.
it. Go
Like,
ahead.
there's a podcast on Spotify called, I believe, it's about panpsychism. If you keyword panpsychism, you find it. And these guys, they tend to talk more about personalities than actual ideas, but they are versed in the panpsychism, the what conception of God and the universe, pantheism, model. And so, like, I'm guessing they probably know a lot of women, or at least some, who share our beliefs. So it's probably best
Ah,
for our purpose, yeah, to, like, so let's reach out to them. And then they, if they want to be a guest on our show also, we could do that too. So how's that sound?
yeah. I was trying to understand why that came to mind for you, and if there was something. Um, so what occurred to me is, like, you were articulating this, made me realize this challenge we have, like, find a female guest speakers or co-host on the God show, right? But they're all going to have, some God view that's probably not going to be defined by some religion, some specific religion, right? Whereas this panpsychism, that's very much more in line with our definition of God as everything, right? That we've been talking about on this show. Um, so yeah, so I was totally agreeing with what you're saying. That's a great idea. Um, I was just realizing what your mind was coming up with. It seems the genius of it was a solution to this problem that we hadn't actually said. And the problem with, like, getting a female host or guest on the God show to talk about God is, when we're trying to create a new definition or version or vision of God, is their version of God or vision of God is probably going to be, confined to one of the other traditional, concepts. Hmm.
All right, do you want to reach out to these guys, or should I?
Yeah, go ahead. Definitely do that.
I'd prefer you did.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll work on it offline, off air,
Sounds good.
both
Yeah.
of us
Yeah,
together.
buddy.
Um, yeah, let's continue with this train of thought. So, the problem I have with panpsychism, and there's a lot of people I
You gotta
really,
define it for the audience. People don't know.
okay, so why don't you define it? Because you have, or
Well,
your understanding.
panpsychism is really kind of like pantheism, but it's like that reality is a mind. That God's mind. And I think we could, use God as the designator of the psyche, is pervasive, is what is. It's universal.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, you brought up another great point. Is maybe, pantheists, finding a pantheist would be even a better match for us, because, I mean, that is much more in line with our definition of God. And I don't know if there's any pantheist podcasts or communities. Um, and I
Again, there
haven't.
is one. It's got pantheism. They call it something else, but if you keyword pantheism, it's like they do a lot of shows. They're pretty sharp.
Okay, yeah, that would be another great lead. Um, yeah, so panpsychism, uh, this idea, you know, what is consciousness is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, modern problems in philosophy, not just philosophy, theology, religion, the world, and we're just now evolving to realize that, right? Um, pan, so panpsychism, my problem with it is it's too it's saying consciousness exists in matter. That's probably the simplest problem I have with. To say consciousness exists in inanimate matter, for instance, a molecule, I think is basically taking my view of consciousness too far, right? Because as soon as you do that, it's so hard to attach to, like, it's dehumanizing consciousness from my perspective. And so, so much of it, we all have stuff in our unconscious that's undealt with, that's controlling our lives, that's limiting us, that's causing problems, keeping us from reaching our goals, causing us to reach goals that end up devastating the world. I mean, this is largely what capitalism has done, and socialism did the same thing in another way. But so when we start talking about rocks are conscious, metals conscious, I think we are going too far, because that stops us from being able to talk about consciousness with the empathy for, recognizing. Basically, we can't apply modern psychology to panpsychism, right?
All right, I'm going to try to address this. I haven't thought about this that much, but like, let's see if I can come up with a plausible explanation. Scientifically, subatomic particles behave under the laws of nature. So basically, they're being compelled by the laws of nature, and by the laws of nature, we can basically say by God's will. So in order for them to be compelled by these laws of nature, by God's will, it seems plausible that they are, quote unquote, aware of these compulsions, more so than that. Well, I mean, they may not be aware, but the other part is that, we define God as everything. And God knows everything, and God is everything. God has power over everything. So these particles are part of God. I think that's the key. That's the key. If God, actually, it all comes down to God being everything. If God is everything, and God is a consciousness, then certainly these particles must be part of God and God's consciousness.
Yeah. So right now, if I talk about, let's use like a reformed view of addiction, which I think is a more scientific, for an example, a more scientific view, right? So we say that somebody who's addicted is we apply consciousness to them, right? And we say that something in their consciousness is causing them to do a drug, that maybe they're past the stage of denial where they realize they have a problem and they want help because it's destroying their lives, destroying their family, their job, whatever. They want help, but they can't stop. Something in their consciousness is causing them. Through good psychology, we can look at it, and they can get therapy and realize that trauma they suffered in childhood is causing this, right? Or something, right? Some form of consciousness that they experienced is still lingering in the unconscious, causing them to do bad behaviors or whatever behaviors they don't want to, right? Now, and we can apply all that, right? And as soon as we expand the definition of consciousness to rocks and the pavement and the highway, then we're diluting this very valuable scientific understanding of consciousness and word consciousness that we have. I mean, it's really a lot of what's happened to the word God, diluted it and made it such a meaningless word almost, because, yeah. So, that's my big concern with it, with using the word consciousness in this way and conceptualizing consciousness, because, right, you can't work, the laws of physics aren't going to change. A rock is, two chemicals are always going to react based on the laws of chemistry, right? And so to call the laws of chemistry consciousness doesn't do a lot of good. instead of just calling it the laws of chemistry, right? But it does a lot of bad, because now with this word consciousness that's so powerful and has so much use, doesn't have the use and the powerful and the clear definition where we can apply it in this case of this person hurting from addiction or PTSD or depression, right? And I'll let you talk for a minute.
Yeah, you're describing two paradigms. Within the scientific paradigm, absolutely, we want to see chemicals as behaving according to natural law. But within the theological, more expansive context, we have to understand, again, it goes back to God being everything. We can't get around the attribute of God being everything. God is, so if God is everything, God has to be a part of these particles, part of these chemical processes.
But you're saying the definition of God being, you're saying the definition of consciousness is God being everything. That's not you can just call it God being everything, or you can make up a new word.
I didn't say
right?
the definition of conscious is God being everything. I said the definition of God is that God is everything. Obviously, if consciousness is part of everything, consciousness is part of God.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. So I'm trying to think of another way to articulate my qualms with panpsychism. And they may be completely off. I mean, all of these schools of thought change and evolve, and that may be an old school. I think it's still current to consider rocks as consciousness, and and let me offer this. This is why I think I think the exact same things happened with religion and panpsychism, right? Basically, the ego is being challenged with, used to we think we're consciousness, just like I'm a self, I have a self, I have free will. We were taught to think that way. Now, when scientific information comes along that says we don't have a free will, or, the self isn't all that, then the ego kicks in and it tries to, that's like so painful to the ego. And we try to come up with all these explanations to spiritually bypass, right? This is what happened in Hinduism, for instance, from my understanding. The symbol of Hinduism, the Advaita, what we know in America as the Om symbol, because that's what yoga studios advertise with, and they call it the Om, right? That symbol means it means non-duality, right? It means basically free will is an illusion. But that was so challenging for people of India to accept, for Hindus to accept. That's what drove them to create all of these crazy rituals and all these alternative explanations. I've watched this happen, or if you study it, you can see this happening over and over again in religions. It happened when Martin Luther wrote the book, The Bondage of the Free Will, the bondage of the will, the whole basis for the Reformation, he said. Now Protestants don't even know the concept or that the book exists, because the ego, for hundreds of years has tried to escape that fact, so much so that they don't even know what their roots are, right?
All right, again, so like back to, so yes, I mean, the idea is we can see reality as an object, these particles, these force fields. That's what, this is the reductionist, purely scientific view, or we can endow reality with the attribute of beingness. We are people. We don't consider ourselves things, objects. And to objectify someone is actually to treat them wrongfully. And so it's important to see our reality within the context of personification, of seeing God not as a thing, not as this universe that has no consciousness, has no purpose, just has these laws that are arbitrary, indiscriminate. That objectifies reality. It objectifies us. So I think because we are people, persons with this kind of identity of having, I mean, it may be arbitrary to an extent, and may be a disparagement of the material world that we may actually evolve beyond. but we're not there yet. So it seems that to the extent we view God as not just the supreme being, but the only being, that personifies reality. You know, that means that God is within every particle, within every quark, within every law of nature. You know, the forces and the principles that act upon mass energy. So so yeah, so then, all right, so we have this view of God as a being, the only being, and we're reflecting God's will. And God's will is the only will, because again, God is everything. God obviously controls everything. So, so we move from this perspective now that God is out there to God is everywhere, and we're within God. We're part of God. You know, that unifies us with God. That again, this ennobles us not just from the perspective of personhood. It ennobles us from the perspective of we being part of the supreme being, the only being. It unifies us with what is, with God. So this is the kind of consciousness we want to promote. We want the world to understand, because I believe that proper understanding of God is very helpful to a proper understanding of our world, how to make it better, how to solve problems. Just again, one example is the idea that that we're manifesting God's will, where we believe that we have a free will, that what we do is up to us. And we all know, I mean, Joshua and I know how many problems that causes. You know, we understand. I've written books about this. You know, it's just a very harmful belief. And to the extent that we understand God properly and our relation to God as part of God, then not only are we seeing reality most accurately, but we're also seeing reality in a way that I believe allows for greater, faster progress in creating essentially a blissful world. That's what we're going for. We're going for a blissful, virtuous world where we stop doing things that are sinful and we stop feeling negative emotions to as much as we can. And so this is what God has always been about. This is what religion has always been about. So, but again, the idea is that to govern ourselves the best politically, socially, it really helps to understand a proper relationship that we have with God, the accurate relationship, not the relationship that's expressed by this, again, very harmful, mistaken belief in free will. That, you know, the belief in free will, it just basically, it causes us to consider ourselves idols, to worship ourselves. It's actually blasphemous. And blasphemy is actually, in religion, this idea that we're not supposed to, very reasonably, attribute to ourselves that which belongs to God. If God is all powerful, if God is responsible for anything, for everything, then for us to claim a certain responsibility for anything is a blasphemous thought. You know, and like, you know, blasphemous wasn't taken all that lightly in previous generations. It's because it leads to idolatry. To the extent that we believe we can create things like God can create things, then we idolize ourselves and each other, and that basically threatens our humility, and much more so, it threatens our basic understanding of God.
At the very beginning there, you brought up personification. I really like that. And it made me think of a way I could argue with myself here and see where it settles with you, how it settles with you. Um, so before we were talking, I was criticizing panpsychism, saying that calling everything consciousness and coming, redefining consciousness as if rocks are conscious and the pavement and the road is consciousness and all of this, right? And I think that's a very dangerous. Yeah, I think humanity is probably going to be misled and do that to its detriment in the future, but I think it's very problematic. Now, on the flip side, you mentioned this personification. On the flip side, I have this deep respect. All right, so that's about consciousness. I have this very deep respect of the roots of probably all religion, right, which is animism and spiritism. Not there's a religious group called spiritism that was in the 1800s. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about spiritism in the sense that everything is a spirit. The rock is a spirit. In a sense, this is where totem comes from. Totem poles, I think is probably the most common conception of this, right? And this was probably what predated shamanism, what we call the catch-all phrase shamanism, right? So, and I think this played one of the largest roles in the evolution of consciousness, right? And us being able to understand God, or at least evolve this God consciousness. And that was for us to personify, us assigning or early hominids and humans assigning human attributes, right, to things in the environment to make it more real, more vivid, because most of our consciousness at that time had evolved to relate to another human being. That's how we spend all of our time. We're a human being, they're a human being. We can think about our own thoughts in our head by watching other people. We can think about the thoughts in other people's heads by thinking about our own thoughts, right? And so when an early human started doing this, the spirit of the rock, the spirit of the, and it was all, of course, very much tied to survival, right? Trying to figure out where the food is, what the forecast, when's a storm going to come? Why is there rain sometimes and not other times? And the crops are dying, or, whatever. And I really appreciate that, to the extent that I think that's probably a more appropriate conception of God compared to the conception of God that we have today, especially in this country, right? Is to think in terms of the spirits, everything that we in our environment, all of causality is essentially spirits, right? And has a spiritual implication, or rather interact with everything as if it's a spiritual endeavor, right? To the extent that I think if we had to choose between sticking with God the way it's currently defined or most people's conceptions, we should just throw it out, quit using the word, and use the word spirits instead. The in between there would be, okay, let's use the word gods. Everything's a god, right? And there's gods. There's not one singular God, except for when you're talking about everything, right? But the only time you should use the word God singular is if you're talking about everything. Otherwise, you should try to use the word gods, because we're so twisted in our thinking about God that would be the best thing we could do to correct. So I really appreciated when you brought up that personification, how it made me challenge myself in what I just said to try to reconcile panpsychism, saying everything is conscious. And I think that's one of the most dangerous things that's happening right now in the spirituality communities, with reconciling that with my appreciation for this appreciation of spirits and animism, and thinking of everything in that way.
This idea of God and gods would be confusing to the world, because the way we understand gods from Greek mythology, for example, is that these gods were in conflict. I mean, there was a Zeus, there was a main god, but it's not like he had omnipotent power. So, so I believe that, and the thing is, like, God is not a bad or wrong word. For example, we could apply, we could say that, well, humanity has done so much wrong that we should like find another word for humanity. That's kind of like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's just not necessary. You know, we should fight, we should defend the use of the word God, not as it's been perverted or corrupted, but the use as it is.
I don't think you would apply that same logic to anything else. You know, we could say that the Nazi Party had some good ideas, and we shouldn't, you know, or this is largely in our country, the reason that the Confederate flag is so protected. You know, that the right for states to govern themselves, right? And so that we should still have the Confederate flag. We should still appreciate the Confederate flag. You know, I'm not
Well,
taking a
the
position on
Nazis,
either of them,
I
but
mean, the Nazis killed millions of people.
so has God. So has the use of the word God. So has
Right, but
every, you know,
I mean, and so we don't come
I
up with
mean,
a different word for Nazi. We have a word for Nazi that everyone understands as like
and
really.
we quit using it. We say that's a bad thing and all a bad thing. And if you use the word Nazi or
We say
identify
it's
as
a
a
bad
Nazi,
thing, but we don't say that. I mean, like, God, we understand as primarily a very good thing. You know, which, you know, God being everything is responsible for everything happening. But you know, yes, we keep the word. We haven't abandoned the word Nazi. We haven't abandoned the word Confederate. Why should we abandon words when people misconstrue them?
we abandon using it in a good term, in a good way. All right. And you could, I mean, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we abandoned the Nazis in a good way because they never were good. They, you
That's
know,
not
like,
true. That you cannot say that anything is pure evil. There
I'm
was
not saying they're pure
most
evil.
a good look at Operation Paperclip in Wikipedia. We hired so many Nazi scientists, and they thought so much more clear than our scientists. They came up with so much medicine, so much logic and rationale. I'm not defending the
Yeah,
Holocaust or genocide, but I'm not defending the Crusades either.
and
By
neither would I. Both are really evil. That's what I'm saying. In other words, like the Crusades are evil, Nazism was evil. You know, we don't throw out these words. These words are important to remember so we don't relive their mistakes, you know, the kind of pain they wanted to inflict on the world because of their ideology, their beliefs.
so let's take one that's a little easier. Like I'm trying to think of one. I mean, the Confederate one's pretty easy. I mean, I don't um, appreciate
Well,
or
they
believe
were
in it. I'm
supporting
saying, but
slavery. They were supporting slavery. That's evil.
so is the church. So is God. So is the use of the word God. You know,
But
is supporting
within the
slavery.
context, they gave it up. You know, yes, it's in the Bible, slavery is allowed, but we don't do that anymore. Whereas the Confederates were trying to perpetuate that.
You could say that they. Well, we're not. Let's. I think as we. Well, I don't know. You keep talking.
All right, let's get back to God. So,
Let me ask you. No, here we go. You tell me a case at which we should stop using the word God. Imagine a different reality. Imagine enough atrocities being committed in the name of God. What if the Nazis, you know, or somebody even way more evil than the Nazis were saying God is telling us to do this, we're doing this. And if it was still happening, just give me some scenario that George Ortega would say, okay, this word God is just causing too much problems. It's too ambiguous. We can still have spirituality, or we can still have the same concept, but we're going to choose this other word. Tell me some scenario.
that's a good question. All right, so like, you know, you're posing a hypothetical that I don't believe is realistic. In other words, like in our personal lives, goodness and pleasure and happiness generally far outweigh, you know, their opposites. So let's say to take your example, you know, reality turned that way, we would still call God God because God by definition is everything. But, you know, having said that, again, I don't think that that prospect is realistic because God, as we understand God, has been leading us as a world to greater and greater happiness, health, prosperity, you know, goodness. So yes, I mean, like even if everything, you know, just like, you know, through some very improbable means turned very evil, we would still have to call God God because God is obviously everything, and this evil would be part of everything. But the important point to consider is that we should be grateful that we're living in a world where things are getting better and better and better.
Yeah. Yeah. How many minutes we got left?
We've got about 6,
Okay,
7.
let's depart from. I'm going to try to depart from the philosophical and the theological conversation, and you can kind of take us in the direction that you're good at, and I think the alcohol and the Fabringen's good at, of the true spirit of the show, of love, happiness, and an understanding of God that increases that in our lives and our relationships. So
Yeah, that,
whatever's on your heart and mind in that direction.
yeah, because like, I'm thinking about like religions that they don't get political a lot of times. And sometimes I'm thinking maybe they should, but what they tend to do is they tend to no, I better not go in that direction, because like, I think they really should get more involved in politics. I mean, like, but
Okay.
all right. So I want to get back to like, you want to start a religion. This is like, a movement to get people to understand accurately, this show at least, God, who God is. And so let's talk about bringing more people into this mission. And actually, let's talk about it not from a logistic perspective, but from a theological perspective of basically, I mean, you could theorize that the more people we bring into this, the potentially more influential the aspect of consciousness that we're accessing, so that our messages are amplified much more so. I mean, that's kind of obvious anyhow, in a very mundane sense. But how do we God seems to be, by your message earlier today, leading us to bring more people into this show, and again, like not just this woman, but perhaps women from that we'd get the referrals to from that panpsychism, whatever that podcast. All right, so basically, it seems to me what I'm trying to say, because this is like so interesting, is like we never know what we're going to say until we start saying it. So God now has me realizing that what God is like basically having me emphasize,
Empathize and emphasize.
Yes. All right. Basically that yes, that God is apparently, as far as we can tell, leading us to want to expand this initiative that we're working on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that comes to mind is we don't have one scriptural text, or one. We're of different persuasions, and also we're, we don't have one codified, and that's always the challenge. I mean, like the Baha'i faith, those types of organizations that have this coexist philosophy and drawing from all religions is pretty difficult. I think it's coming to mind. There's a quote that says, "A mad idea, one person with a mad idea is just madness or insanity." The French have a term for two people that share a mad idea. It's like a folie d'eau. I can't say French, but French have this understanding of two people with mad idea. If three people have the same mad idea, that is a cult. If four people have a mad idea, that's a religion. If five people have a mad idea, that's the new reality, right? And so I think kind of maybe defining that mad idea, right, and what that is, or the tenets of it, right? And I think largely it is, this illusory nature of free will, or the illusion of free will, and a couple other key points with God not being good, only good, right? And so these key things, right? And so that's kind of the baseline where, for people, that's kind of the pre-qualifications you're bringing for bringing people in, and then everything else after that, whatever we define as our own personal cardinal sins, we don't impose that on the rest of the group, or we say that's open for debate. That's part of our conversation, discussion. That would be one thought that comes to mind. But I think, that bring it back to this, tied in with the spirit of the show of, improving relationships and love, enhancing love and happiness. That always has to kind of be also a premise, I think.
All right, we've got a minute and 45 seconds left. So let's say, again, we're experimenting with the 1.5 speed format and with the Farbringen, basically context. I'm feeling the influence of alcohol. Alcohol, wine especially, has been used in religions immemorial. I mean, like basically, from the, it must have been an amazing discovery for them to have, come upon this agent that would allow them to better access God. So that's what part of this experiment is. Okay, so we got to see, I think we've recorded enough for we just recorded 2 episodes. It's Christmas Eve, so maybe I may record something tomorrow or something. I'm not sure, but again, this is like, we are the only program in the world ever historically that has been focused completely, well, as much as we can, on understanding God accurately. It's not like, religions have a lot more to them, and they, so many religions, they just talk about everything but God, which is like kind of curious. So we're going to keep doing this, and it's not up to us. It's apparently what God wants us to do. And, this is episode number 48 already. So I imagine by the time we're at episode 90 or 120, our understanding of God will have increased as well as yours. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.